Welcome to Plain Sight Docs. Thank you for joining us as we continue our mission to uncover the truths hidden just beneath the surface. Tonight, we open one of the darkest, most painful, and most shameful files in the American archive. In our previous investigations, we've seen wolves in many forms: the corporate polluter poisoning a town for profit, the corrupt sheriff ruling his county with a bloody iron fist, the cult leader seizing control of a community's land and politics. These are stories of external forces or individuals betraying the public trust. But tonight, we confront a betrayal that is, in many ways, far more intimate, more systematic, and more monstrous. This is not a story of a wolf hiding in the woods, or even a wolf wearing a badge. This is the story of a wolf wearing a doctor's white coat, wielding the full authority of the United States federal government. This is a crime where the weapon was not a gun, but a placebo, where the betrayal was not a single violent act of passion, but a cold, calculated, bureaucratic, 4-decade-long lie. This is the true story of a medical study, funded and executed by the United States Public Health Service, in which hundreds of its own citizens were deliberately, systematically, and repeatedly denied life-saving medicine, simply to observe in meticulous scientific detail how they suffered, sickened, went blind, went mad, and died. This is the story of the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. For 40 consecutive years, from 1932 to 1972, agents of the U.S. Public Health Service, the very agency sworn to protect the nation's health, conducted this study on a hand-picked group of 600 impoverished, rural, black men in Macon County, Alabama. Of these men, 399 had already contracted syphilis before the study began. The remaining 201, who were free of the disease, served as a control group. The 399 men with syphilis were never told they had a sexually transmitted disease. They were told they had bad blood, a vague, insidious, local term for a host of ailments. They were not just untreated in a passive sense. The government physicians actively, and with documented effort, prevented them from receiving treatment. They were blocked from accessing other clinics. They were even prevented from being cured by the U.S. Army during World War II. When penicillin became the universal, cheap, and miraculous cure for syphilis in the mid-1940s, the study continued for another 25 years, with doctors deliberately withholding the cure, watching as the men died, went blind, and suffered strokes, all to gather more data for their final autopsy reports. This was not a secret, rogue operation conducted by a few sadistic doctors. This was a publicly funded long-term medical study, approved at the highest levels of the PHS, supported by local health departments, and lauded by many in the medical community. Stories like this aren't rare. They're just usually ignored. If you want to hear more hidden histories, true betrayals, and the truths that were never meant to be seen, subscribe. We tell the stories they tried to bury. To understand how such an atrocity could be conceived and executed, we must first immerse ourselves in the time and place of its creation. We must travel back, not just to a different era, but to a different, almost unrecognizable America. Macon County, Alabama, in the year 1932. This was not just the Jim Crow South, with its legally mandated, violently enforced system of racial apartheid. This was the absolute, crushing depths of the Great Depression. The two forces combined to create an environment of almost total desperation and vulnerability for the county's black population. Macon County was profoundly rural, a collection of small hamlets and sprawling cotton fields, geographically and culturally isolated. And it was devastatingly, almost feudally poor. It was the statistical heart of the Black Belt, a region so named for its dark, fertile soil, the same soil that had made it a center of the slave economy a century earlier. In 1932, the vast majority of its residents, over 80%, were black, and they were, almost without exception, destitute. The economic structure was built on sharecropping, a system that in practice was little more than neo-serfdom. Black families lived on white-owned land, farmed cotton for the landowner, and were paid in credit at the landowner's store, a system designed to ensure they were in perpetual inescapable debt, legally binding them to the land generation after generation. The illiteracy rate was staggering, exceeding 30% among the black population. The housing was substandard, often consisting of crumbling, unpainted, uninsulated, two-room wooden shacks, frequently lacking any basic sanitation, window screens, or even a clean source of water, relying on contaminated wells or streams. Nutrition was abysmal, based on a meager diet of corn, molasses, and salt pork, leading to widespread endemic diseases of poverty like pellagra and rickets. And medical care. For the 30,000 black residents of Macon County, it was, for all practical purposes, non-existent. There were reportedly only 2 hospitals in the entire county that would even admit black patients, and even then in segregated, underfunded wards. White doctors would often refuse to treat black patients, or would do so only for exorbitant fees far beyond the reach of any sharecropper. Life expectancy for a black man in Macon County was tragically short, by some estimates as low as 35 years. This was a population on the absolute margins of American society, invisible, disenfranchised, uneducated, voiceless, and profoundly, dangerously vulnerable. They were, from the cold, detached perspective of an outside governmental agency, a perfect, isolated, static pool of test subjects. What should I? Into this world of crushing poverty and medical neglect came a devastating hidden plague, syphilis. Today we think of syphilis as a curable, albeit serious, sexually transmitted disease. But in the 1930s, before the discovery and mass production of penicillin, syphilis was a terrifying, life-altering, and ultimately fatal diagnosis. It was a disease of insidious stages, each more horrific than the last. The primary stage, a painless sore called a chancre, might go unnoticed or be dismissed. The secondary stage, often appearing weeks or months later, could involve a non-itchy rash, fever, and flu-like symptoms, which would eventually disappear on their own, lulling the victim into a false sense of recovery. But then, the disease would enter its most malevolent phase, the latent stage. The spirochetes bacteria, Treponema pallidum, would hide in the body silently for years, sometimes for 10, 20, even 30 years, showing no outward symptoms, all while slowly, relentlessly, burrowing into the body's core systems. The true horror of the disease was the tertiary stage, when it re-emerged with catastrophic force. It could manifest as cardiovascular syphilis, attacking the aorta, the body's main artery, causing it to weaken and balloon into massive, fatal aneurysms. It could grow gummas, large, rubbery, destructive, inflammatory tumors that could erupt on the skin, or more terrifyingly in internal organs and on bones, literally eating away at a person's face or skeleton. And most feared of all, it could manifest as neurosyphilis. The bacteria would invade the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and the brain itself. This led to a slow, agonizing descent, blinding, deafness, crippling paralysis as the spinal cord decayed, and ultimately a profound, irreversible dementia, a complete disintegration of the personality, as the brain itself was consumed by the disease. It was a disease that didn't just kill you, it dismantled you, physically and mentally, piece by piece over decades. And in Macon County, due to the complete lack of medical care, diagnosis, or public health education, syphilis was rampant. Estimates at the time suggested that over 35% of the adult black population in the county was infected. It was, in short, a full-blown public health catastrophe. The U.S. Public Health Service, or PHS, the nation's premier federal health agency, knew about this catastrophe. In fact, they had been peripherally involved. In the late 1920s, a philanthropic foundation, the Julius Rosenwald Fund, had provided significant funding for a PHS-led project to identify and treat syphilis in 5 rural southern counties, including Macon County. This was a well-intentioned, if deeply flawed, program. The cures for syphilis at the time were themselves brutal, toxic, and of questionable efficacy. They consisted of long, painful, and dangerous courses of injections of arsenic-based compounds like arsphenamine, also known as salvarsan or the magic bullet, and heavy metals like mercury and bismuth. These treatments, which had to be administered weekly for months or even years, were agonizing. The arsenic compounds were highly toxic, frequently causing severe side effects like kidney failure, liver damage, blindness, and sometimes even death from the cure itself. The program was difficult to administer, and compliance among the sharecropper population, who couldn't afford to miss a day of work, was low. Then, in 1929, the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression began. By 1932, the Rosenwald Fund's endowment had been devastated. The funding for the treatment program was pulled, and the PHS clinics in Macon County were shuttered. This left the PHS, and specifically the directors of its venereal disease division in Washington, D.C., with a unique and, in their view, scientifically valuable data set, a large, isolated, medically naive population of syphilis-positive men who were now, conveniently, no longer receiving the flawed, confounding treatments of the day. In 1932, a decision was made by high-level officials within the PHS desk. The primary architect of the idea was Dr. Taliaferro Clark, pronounced Tolliver Dia. The decision was cold, simple, and rooted in the profoundly racist pseudoscience that permeated the medical establishment of the time. For decades, a prevailing, false, and deeply racist medical theory posited that syphilis affected black and white bodies differently. This theory, based on no actual data, was a grotesque extension of existing racial stereotypes. It was believed and taught in medical schools that black individuals, being simpler and more primitive, were less susceptible to the higher neurological impacts of syphilis, neurosyphilis, but far more susceptible to its lower cardiovascular effects. White individuals, conversely, were believed to be more prone to the mental degradation of neurosyphilis. This was a theory with no scientific basis, rooted in racist stereotypes about black people being simpler organisms, driven more by heart and emotion than by mind and intellect. Dr. Clark and his colleagues, notably Dr. Oliver Winger, saw a golden opportunity. The funding for treatment was gone, but what if they used this population for a study? They were aware of the famous Oslo study from 1891 to 1910, where Norwegian doctors had similarly observed the natural untreated progression of syphilis in a group of nearly 2,000 white patients. But no such data existed for black patients. What if the PHS could conduct a never-again study to scientifically, definitively document the full, natural, untreated progression of syphilis in the Negro male? They wanted to watch the disease unfold, from infection to latency to death to autopsy. They wanted to see, once and for all, if the racist theories were true. Macon County, with its poor, uneducated, medically naive population and its high rate of infection, was the perfect natural laboratory. This was the birth of the study. It is critical to understand that it was not, as some would later attempt to claim, a study in good faith that went wrong when the cure was found. Its original premise in 1932 was fundamentally deceptive and unethical from its very inception. Dr. Clark, who initiated the study, had one small, nagging ethical concern. He worried in an early memo that not telling the men they had syphilis might be a problem. He was quickly overruled by his colleagues, like Dr. Winger, who argued that full disclosure was unnecessary and would scare off the subject. The scientific value of the study, they argued, trumped any individual's right to informed consent. And so, The lie was set. The study was given its dry, bureaucratic, and chillingly honest title, The Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. The untreated part was the key, the entire point. The PSS was not going to Macon County to help. They were going to watch. Now, the PHS, led in the field by Dr. Wenger and his successors, had to recruit its subjects. How do you convince 600 men, 399 of whom are actively sick with a devastating disease, to participate in a long-term, non-therapeutic study where they will receive no actual medicine, only painful diagnostic procedures? You lie. You deceive. Menguar. You exploit their poverty, their trust, and their desperation for any form of medical care. The PHS officials, all white doctors and administrators from Washington, knew they couldn't just roll into the deeply segregated, impoverished, and understandably suspicious black communities of rural Alabama and expect cooperation. They would be seen for what they were, outsiders, government agents. They needed a trusted local intermediary, a black face for their white-run study, to build a bridge of trust that they could then exploit. And they found one in the most respected, powerful, and trusted black institution in the entire South, the Tuskegee Institute. Now, Tuskegee University, this was the college founded by Booker T. Washington, a towering beacon of black education, self-improvement, and advancement. The PHS formed an official partnership with the Institute, setting up its clinics on their grounds, using their medical facilities, and involving its staff. This single strategic move was devastatingly effective. It immediately gave the government study a powerful stamp of legitimacy and trustworthiness in the eyes of the local black population. If the esteemed doctors and nurses at the Tuskegee Institute were involved, it must be a good thing. They also hired a local black public health nurse named Eunice Rivers. This was perhaps the most cynical and most effective part of their entire recruitment and retention plan. Nurse Rivers was not a cold, outside scientist. She was a respected, trusted, and by all accounts, genuinely beloved figure in the Macon County community. She knew the families. She knew the back roads. She was the human, compassionate face of the study for its entire 40-year duration. It was she who drove the PHS car into the cotton fields and sharecropper shacks. It was she who knew the men by name, who talked to their wives, who remembered their children's birthdays. It was she who convinced them, with her reassuring familiar presence, to join the study, to come in for their checkups. She was, in the eyes of the men, their primary advocate, their friend, their link to the modern medicine they believed they were finally receiving. For the PHS, she was their greatest asset, the key to keeping the men in the study, ensuring they never sought treatment elsewhere, and securing their bodies for autopsy. Her presence, a symbol of trust, was tragically weaponized by the PHS to guarantee the decades-long compliance of its victim. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood. This was a brilliant, insidious piece of deception. Bad blood was a vague, local, folksy term, a medical euphemism used within the black community to describe a whole host of common ailments: anemia, fatigue, rheumatism, the misery. It was a catch-all term for feeling unwell. Crucially, the men had no idea it was a synonym for syphilis, a deadly, sexually transmitted disease. They just knew they were sick, and the government, working with the trusted Tuskegee Institute and the kind Nurse Rivers, was offering to help. The incentives offered were, for this desperately poor, medically starved population, irresistible. They were offered free physicals, the first real, comprehensive medical examinations many of these 600 men had ever received in their entire lives. They were given free rides in the official PHS car, a luxury in a community where most people walked or used mule carts. They were served hot, free meals on the days of their examinations, a significant, powerful incentive for men living on the brink of starvation. And in the most ghoulish, Orwellian, and coldly calculated move of all, they were offered burial insurance. The PHS entered into an arrangement with a local burial society, guaranteeing a small sum, perhaps $50, to be paid towards each man's burial expenses. This was presented as the ultimate act of government generosity, ensuring these impoverished men could have the dignity of a proper burial, a decent casket, rather than being laid in a pauper's grave. In exchange for this final gift, the men's families had to agree to a full autopsy upon their death. The PSS was, from the very beginning, planning for and counting on the deaths of its subjects. The autopsies were the study's ultimate goal, the final data points needed to see what the disease had done to the men's organs. It was a poisoned chalice of the cruelest kind. In exchange for a free hot meal, a bottle of aspirin, a few kind words from Nurse Rivers, and the promise of a decent burial, these 600 men unknowingly traded away their lives, their health, their futures, and even their right to informed consent, all for a study whose sole, hidden purpose was to do nothing but watch. So, the study began. 600 men were enrolled. 399 with latent syphilis, the test group. 201 without the disease, the control group. For the next 40 years, this cohort would be followed, tracked, and managed with the meticulousness of a livestock breeding program. The men would be periodically rounded up by Nurse Rivers, brought to the clinic at the Tuskegee Institute, and subjected to a battery of medical examinations. They were weighed. Their blood was drawn. Their vital signs were charted. And in the study's most gruesome, painful, and medically pointless procedure, they were subjected to spinal taps. The doctors lied to the men about this procedure, telling them it was a special free treatment. The men who experienced the agonizing pain of a large needle being inserted into their spines had their own name for it, the back shot. In reality, the spinal taps were purely diagnostic, offering zero therapeutic benefit. They were done solely to extract cerebrospinal fluid, which the PHS doctors would analyze to see if the syphilis bacteria had, as they hoped, progressed to the men's central nervous systems and brains. It was pure data collection, performed under the guise of therapy, a painful, dangerous procedure inflicted upon uninformed, trusting subjects. In return for this cooperation for enduring these painful procedures, the men were given worthless, deceptive treatments. They were handed aspirin for their arthritic aches, iron tonics, or pink medicine. They believed they were being cured. In reality, they were being actively, scientifically observed as they degenerate. The PHS physicians and Nurse Rivers, who became the study's primary, long-term liaison and data collector, meticulously, callously documented the progression of the disease in their logbooks. They took copious notes as the men's vision failed, as they went blind. They charted the development of their heart problems, the telltale signs of cardiovascular syphilis. They documented the skin ulcers, the crippling joint pain, the bone decay. They noted the first signs of paralysis, the shuffling gait of tabes dorsalis, the slow, tragic descent into dementia and madness from neurosyphilis. Every agonizing symptom, every personal tragedy was a data point, a clinical observation to be cataloged for their future research papers. This cold scientific detachment, this profound moral rot at the heart of the U.S. Public Health Service, was the essence of the betrayal. But this betrayal, unethical as it was from its 1932 inception, became infinitely more sinister, more undeniably criminal in the 1940s. In 1943, penicillin was discovered, tested, and by 1947, it had become the standard, universal, and incredibly effective cure for syphilis. It was hailed as a miracle drug. A few simple, inexpensive injections could completely stop the disease in its tracks, halt its progression, and prevent the horrifying tertiary stage entirely. The PHS, the very agency running the Tuskegee study, was the same agency that was now, ironically, setting up public health clinics across the country, called rapid treatment centers, to distribute penicillin and wipe out syphilis nationwide. They knew it was a cure. They celebrated it as a cure. This was the study's critical, moral moment of truth. The original scientific question, what happens to untreated syphilis, was now, for all ethical purposes, moot as a safe, effective, and cheap treatment was available. The PSS had a clear moral and ethical choice: end the study immediately and give these 399 men, their long-term test subjects, the life-saving cure they deserve. Instead, the directors of the PSS Venereal Disease Division, in a series of now infamous internal meetings and memos, made a conscious, deliberate, and monstrous decision to do nothing. They didn't just not treat the men. They actively, systematically, and secretly prevented them from being treated. This is the part of the story that elevates it from gross, tragic negligence to an active, malicious criminal conspiracy. The PHS, the United States government, compiled a list of the 399 syphilitic men in their study. They circulated this list to the Alabama State Health Department. They circulated it to local doctors and clinics throughout the region. They circulated it to the local military draft boards. These men were flagged, blacklisted from receiving the cure. When the U.S. military drafted men for service in World War II, they tested all recruits for syphilis. Those who tested positive were required to be treated with penicillin before being sent into service. But when the men from the Tuskegee study, like Macon County residents, showed up for their draft physicals and tested positive, their names were checked against the PSS's secret list. They were actively, deliberately denied the cure. They were told they didn't need it, or were simply sent home untreated to continue rotting, also they could remain pure subjects for the study. When local doctors, unaffiliated with the study, happened to diagnose one of the men with syphilis and tried to prescribe the standard, legal, ethical treatment of penicillin, the PSS would intervene. Nurse Rivers or a PS doctor would be dispatched to contact that physician, informing them that this man was part of a special long-term government study and that treating him with penicillin would ruin the data. They were, in effect, sentencing their own subjects to a slow, agonizing death over and over for 25 more years after the cure was universally available, all for the sake of pure scientific observation. They valued their data far more than they valued black lives. This 40-year lie, this abuse of power hidden in plain sight within the hallowed halls of the medical community, continued unchecked until 1972. The year 1947 should have marked the definitive, ethical, and compassionate end of the Tuskegee study. Not just its end, but its immediate, urgent, and morally obligatory liquidation. The discovery and subsequent mass production of penicillin in the mid-1940s was not a minor medical development. It was a profound revolution, a true miracle drug. For syphilis, a disease that had terrified and ravaged humanity for centuries, penicillin was not a palliative, not a minor improvement on the toxic arsenic and mercury treatments of the past. It was, for all intents and purposes, a definitive, unambiguous cure. A few simple, relatively inexpensive injections could completely eradicate the Treponema pallidum bacteria from the human body, halting the disease's insidious progression and, if administered early enough in the disease's course, completely preventing the horrifying, debilitating, and inevitably fatal descent into tertiary syphilis, the blind. The U.S. Public Health Service, the very federal agency that was actively, knowingly, and callously conducting the study in Macon County, was simultaneously at the global forefront of this medical revolution. They were the ones championing penicillin's miraculous efficacy. They were the ones establishing and funding rapid treatment centers all across the nation, including, ironically, in the South, with the express, stated public health goal of finding and curing every single case of syphilis in the country. They hoped to eradicate the disease entirely, just as they had with smallpox. The PHS knew, with absolute, incontrovertible scientific certainty, that they held in their hands a cheap, safe, and effective cure. This stark reality presented the doctors and high-level administrators overseeing the Tuskegee study with a clear, undeniable, binary moral and ethical choice. Their original, however ghoulish and racist, scientific premise to passively observe the untreated progression of syphilis in a specific demographic was now, by their own public health standards, rendered completely, utterly obsolete. They had a cohort of 399 men, whom they had been meticulously, deceptively tracking for 15 years, men who were actively suffering, deteriorating, and dying from a disease for which the government now held a near-perfect cure. The choice was simple: end the study immediately, uphold their Hippocratic oath and their duty as public health officials, and provide these 399 men with the life-saving penicillin they deserve. Or continue the study. In a series of now infamous internal meetings and memos, the PHS officials, led by figures like Dr. John R. Heller, the longtime director of the Venereal Disease Division, made their decision. They chose to continue. They deliberately, consciously, bureaucratically, and unanimously decided to withhold the cure. Their reasoning, as documented in their own chillingly detached records, is a terrifying portrait of scientific fanaticism, moral bankruptcy, and profound dehumanization. They argued that the study was not yet scientifically complete. They had not yet followed all the men to the endpoint, a cold clinical euphemism, meaning they had not yet all died and been autopsied. They rationalized that the men, now in middle age, were too old or too far along in the disease's progression for the penicillin treatment to be fully effective, a scientifically dubious and ethically irrelevant claim, as penicillin could still have prevented further suffering and transmission. They argued with a stunning perversion of logic that the scientific value of their unique 40-year longitudinal data set, their never-again opportunity to watch men die, was more important than the individual lives, the health, and the basic humanity of 399 impoverished black men in Alabama. This was the moment the Tuskegee study transformed irrevocably from a non-therapeutic observation, already ethically monstrous, into an active, systematic, and intentional act of prolonged medical battery and arguably negligent homicide. But the betrayal, and this is the most critical point to understand, went far, far deeper than simply passively withholding the cure. The PHS officials knew that in the new, post-penicillin world, they could no longer just sit back and observe. The cure was now cheap, available, and being distributed nationwide. Their subjects, their data points, might accidentally wander into a public health clinic or be drafted by the Army and be cured, thus ruining their decades of pure data. The study to continue had to become an active conspiracy. The PHS now had to become an active gatekeeper, a saboteur of medicine, to ensure their subjects remained pure and untreated. They embarked on a systematic, clandestine, multi-decade conspiracy to actively prevent the men of the Tuskegee study from receiving penicillin from any other source. Their first major test came with World War II, and later, the Korean War. As men from all across America were drafted into military service, they were required to undergo physical examinations, which included routine blood tests for syphilis. The military's public health policy was clear, rigid, and sensible. Any draftee testing positive for syphilis was to be given a full standard course of penicillin before being sent to basic training. The military, for obvious reasons, did not want a syphilis epidemic raging through its barracks. Dozens of men from the Tuskegee study cohort, men in their 30s and 40s, were drafted. They reported for their physicals, as required by law. They tested positive for syphilis. They were, for a brief hopeful moment, on the very brink of being accidentally cured by their own government, an event that would have ruined them as data points for the PHS. The Public Health Service, in a horrifying display of interagency collusion, acted swiftly and decisively to prevent this. They compiled a complete official list of the 399 syphilitic men in their study, complete with their names and draft numbers. They sent this list directly to the local Macon County Draft Board, number 125, with explicit, chilling instructions. When these specific men reported for duty, they were to be excluded from the standard, mandatory penicillin treatment given to all other syphilitic draftees. They were to be prevented from being placed in a position to receive treatment. Think about that. The United States government, through one health agency, identified its own citizens, acknowledged they had a deadly, debilitating disease, and then secretly instructed another branch of the government, the military, to deliberately deny them the cure, all in the name of preserving the scientific purity of a racist, unethical experiment. Many of these men were subsequently classified 4F, unfit for service, and sent home, not because they were too sick to serve, though many were, but because they were too valuable to the study to be cured. They were, in effect, sentenced to a slow, agonizing death by the very government they had been drafted to defend. This active conspiracy extended far beyond the draft board. It permeated the entire local health system. The PHS circulated the list of its 399 subjects to the Alabama State Health Department and to local doctors and clinics throughout the region. These men were, in effect, medically blacklisted. In the event that any of these men, suffering from the worsening, agonizing effects of their disease, the blinding headaches of neurosyphilis, the crippling joint pain, the heart problems, sought help from a local doctor, that doctor was supposed to recognize the name or check the list. If the name matched, the doctor was to be informed, either by the state health department or directly by PHS officials, that this patient was part of a special, long-term government study and that treatment for syphilis, specifically with penicillin, must not be administered. They were told that treating the man would interfere with the scientific results and ruin the study's unique data set. The PHS, the nation's highest public health authority, was actively, systematically instructing doctors to violate their Hippocratic oath, to commit medical malpractice, to deny life-saving medicine to patients in need. They had effectively sentenced 399 of their own citizens to death over and over, all for the sake of pure scientific observation. How was this 40-year lie, this medical imprisonment, maintained? How did the PHS keep these 600 men compliant and trusting for decades, even as their bodies and minds visibly deteriorated? The answer lies with the study's single most effective and most tragic tool of betrayal: Nurse Eunice Rivers. Nurse Rivers was not a distant white male doctor from Washington. She was a black woman, a registered nurse, a graduate of the Tuskegee Institute's own nursing program, and a respected, deeply embedded, and by all accounts, genuinely beloved figure in the Macon County community. For the entire 40-year duration of the study, from 1932 to 1972, she was the constant. The white PHS doctors and administrators rotated in and out, serving their 2-year stints in the field before returning to promotions in Washington. But Nurse Rivers, she was the study. She was its human face, its compassionate arm, its primary point of contact, its memory. She knew the men by their first names. She knew their wives, their children. She drove the dusty, winding back roads of Macon County in her official PHS car, visiting the men in their remote sharecropper shacks, asking about their families, bringing them small comforts, and building deep personal relationships based fundamentally on trust. This trust, cultivated over decades, was the currency the PHS exploited. Nurse Rivers was the one who transported the men to the clinics for their checkups. She was the one who sat with them, held their hands, and listened to their troubles. She was the one who delivered the worthless, deceptive, placebo medicines, the colorful, useless pink pills, the aspirin, and the iron tonics that the men believed were government medicine, a special, advanced treatment for their bad blood. When the men were in agonizing pain from the disease's progression, from the arthritic inflammation, the heart trouble, the neurological aches, they called her, she would dispense aspirin. When they were terrified of the painful, dangerous, and purely diagnostic spinal taps, she was the one who cajoled them, reassured them, and convinced them it was a special free treatment they were lucky to receive. Her presence, her shared race, her medical authority, and her genuine personal kindness were all cynically weaponized by the PHS to maintain the most monstrous long-term deception in plain sight. Then, her role was a profound, tragic paradox. By all accounts, she was a kind woman who genuinely cared for the men as individuals, and yet she was the primary, knowing instrument of their deception. She was the shepherdess, patiently, gently, guiding her flock of 399 syphilitic men, keeping them loyal to the study, preventing them from seeking real medical help elsewhere, which she and the PHS doctors referred to as outside treatment, and ensuring their compliance all the way to the endpoint, the autopsy table. When a man died, it was often Nurse Rivers who would arrive at the home, console the grieving widow, and then, in the same breath, gently remind her of the burial insurance's agreement, securing the family's permission for the all-important autopsy. Her presence, a symbol of trust, was what kept them untreated. That trust is what killed them. The study wasn't just a passive observation. It was a continuous, active, and resource-intensive deception. Year after year, decade after decade, the PHS, with Nurse Rivers as its indispensable field general, kept the lie alive. They continued to provide the worthless placebos. They continued to perform the painful, diagnostic, non-therapeutic spinal taps. They continued to pay for the burials. And they continued to celebrate their scientific achievements, even as their subjects suffered and died from a disease they could have cured in a matter of days. This is, perhaps, the most chilling and incomprehensible aspect of the entire 40-year affair. The Tuskegee study was not a secret, rogue, black ops experiment hidden from the world. It was a source of institutional pride within the Public Health Service. The PHS published its findings repeatedly. Throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, at least 15 different, highly detailed scientific papers, authored by the very PHS doctors conducting the study, were published in America's most prestigious, peer-reviewed medical journals, including the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, the American Journal of Syphilis, Gonorrhea, and Venereal Diseases, and Public Shelf Reports. These papers, read by thousands of doctors, scientists, and public health officials across the country, openly, clinically, and dispassionately discussed the study's methodology. They explicitly stated that the subjects were untreated and were being followed until death. They detailed the horrifying complications the men were suffering, the rates of cardiovascular lesions, the percentage of neurological decay, the higher mortality rates compared to the control group. And the American medical community as a whole said nothing. No one, it seems, raised a significant public ethical objection. No major medical society, no university ethics board, no prominent journal editor blew the whistle. In fact, the study was often praised. It was seen as a valuable contribution to medical knowledge, a unique natural experiment that could never be replicated. The systemic racism was so profound, so deeply ingrained, that the idea of black men being used as human guinea pigs was, if not actively celebrated, passively accepted as a normal, unremarkable part of scientific research. The system's moral failure was so complete that it had multiple chances to stop itself and actively chose not to. In 1969, just 3 years before the study was finally exposed, a committee at the Federal Centers for Disease Control, CDC, which had by then inherited oversight of the study from the PHS, met specifically to review the study's ethics. This was not 1932. This was 1969. This was after the Civil Rights Movement, after the March on Washington, after the Nuremberg Code, established following the Nazi medical atrocities at Nuremberg, had explicitly codified the non-negotiable principle of informed consent in human experimentation. This CDC committee, composed of doctors and public health officials, reviewed the 40-year-old study, acknowledged that penicillin was the cure, acknowledged the men were untreated, and they voted to continue it. They affirmed, in an official internal report, that the study still had scientific merit, that the data from the impending autopsies was crucial, and that stopping now to treat the handful of surviving elderly men was scientifically unnecessary and would spoil the purity of the 40-year data. The system, given a clear final chance to correct its own monstrous, decades-old error, looked itself in the mirror and formally, bureaucratically, doubled down on the lie. The PSS even designed a certificate, a grotesque token of appreciation, which it awarded to the men after 25 years in the study, printed on high-quality paper, thanking them for their loyal participation in the Tuskegee study. The betrayal was not just medical, it was bureaucratic, academic, and systemic. The entire institution of American public health, it seemed, was complicit in this atrocity, hiding its profound inhumanity behind the opaque, impenetrable jargon of scientific progress, bureaucratic procedure, and longitudinal data. The lie persisted, not in darkness, but in the broad open daylight of published, peer-reviewed medical literature, accepted and implicitly condoned by the very communities sworn to do no harm. The lie was so complete, so institutionalized, so self-protected that it likely would have continued exactly as the CDC had planned until the last man was dead, autopsied, and his data filed away, if not for one man. His name was Peter Buxton. Buxton was not a high-level doctor or a powerful politician. He was a young, idealistic epidemiologist and social worker, working as a venereal disease interviewer for the Public Health Service in San Francisco in the mid-1960s. He was, in essence, a low-level government employee, a cog in the vast PHS machine. In 1965, he happened to overhear colleagues at a PHS conference casually, clinically discussing the Tuskegee study. He was horrified. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, that the U.S. government, his own employer, was actively withholding penicillin from a group of men in the 1960s just to see what would happen. He thought it must be a misunderstanding, a grotesque rumor. He began to investigate internally. He found the published papers. He pulled the internal reports. He confirmed the horrifying truth, believing, naively, that this was a grotesque oversight, a forgotten rogue study that his superiors would immediately correct if they were made aware of it. Buxton wrote a formal letter. In 1966, he sent a detailed, passionate letter directly to the directors of the Venereal Disease Division of the PHS, outlining his profound ethical, moral, and medical objections to the study. He argued that the study was racist, unethical, scientifically worthless, as it was based on a population that was not representative and was hopelessly compromised by the men sometimes getting outside treatment, and a moral abomination. What was the PHS's response to this clear internal whistleblower? Did they thank him for his moral clarity? Did they immediately convene an emergency meeting to halt the study and treat the men? No. They shut him down. High-level PHS officials, including the director of the Venereal Disease Division, Dr. William Brown, convened a meeting, not to discuss ending the study but to discuss Peter Buxton's impertinent letter. They meticulously, bureaucratically, and condescendingly refuted his points, one by one. They reaffirmed their collective belief that the study was scientifically valuable, that the men were not being harmed, as they were beyond saving anyway, and that the study must continue to its end point. They effectively told Buxton that he, a low-level employee, was wrong, that he didn't understand the big picture, and that he should drop the matter immediately if he valued his career. The system protected itself. The lie continued uninterrupted. Peter Buxton was stunned, disillusioned, and horrified. He resigned from the Public Health Service, in large part over this very issue. But he never, ever forgot. The knowledge of what was happening in Macon County, Alabama, The fact that this state-sponsored atrocity was continuing haunted him. He knew that the official channels had failed. He knew the system was corrupt and would never ever police itself. He realized that the only way to stop the study was to go outside the system, to break the code of silence. He waited. He gathered his thoughts. And then, nearly 6 years later, in 1972, he made a fateful decision. He decided to leak the entire story to a journalist. The 40-year lie was about to be confronted by the one force it could not control, the front page of the Washington Post. The decision by the Centers for Disease Control in 1969 to formally review and then consciously continue the Tuskegee study was a profound internal moral failure, a catastrophic abdication of ethical oversight. The highest echelons of the American public health system, the very institutions trusted to protect the nation, had reviewed the 37-year-old experiment, an experiment they knew involved the active, systematic withholding of a known, effective life-saving cure from hundreds of its citizens, and they gave it their official, bureaucratic blessing to proceed. The system had proven, beyond any doubt, that it was utterly incapable of self-correction. The 40-year lie, now fortified by a fresh modern layer of institutional approval from the CDC itself, was set to continue indefinitely, exactly as the PHS doctors had always intended, until the last, dying man, subject number 399, had been autopsied, his organs weighed, his tissues sectioned, and his final data points filed away in a cabinet in Atlanta. The betrayal, it seemed, was complete, permanent, and perfectly insulated from any external scrutiny, hidden in plain sight within the pages of obscure, specialized medical journals and the classified internal files of the Public Health Service. But the system, in its arrogant bureaucratic certainty, had failed to account for one critical, lingering variable, the unyielding conscience of a single, low-level employee who had years earlier seen the truth and refused to forget it. That man was Peter Buxton. When Buxton had first lodged his internal protest against the study back in 1966, he was a 29-year-old social worker and epidemiologist, a venereal disease interviewer, working for the Public Health Service in a field office in San Francisco. He was, in his own later words, a junior-grade nobody, a small cog in the vast imposing PHS machine. He had by chance overheard senior colleagues at a PHS conference casually, clinically discussing the Tuskegee study and its unique cohort of untreated subjects. Buxton was at first simply confused, then profoundly horrified. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, that the U.S. government, his own employer, was actively, knowingly, letting a group of its own citizens die from a curable disease in the 1960s, just to observe the results. He assumed, charitably, that it must be a grotesque misunderstanding, a forgotten rogue study that had fallen through the bureaucratic cracks. He began to investigate internally, using his PHS credentials to access the relevant files. He found the 15 or so published medical papers that had emerged from the study over the decades. He read them, and his horror was confirmed. There, in the dry, clinical, dispassionate language of scientists, was the truth, hidden in plain sight for all the medical world to see. The papers openly stated the subjects were untreated, observed without therapy, and were being followed until death. They clinically documented the higher rates of cardiovascular lesions, the percentage of neurological decay, the higher mortality rates compared to the 201 control subjects. Believing, naively, that this was a grotesque oversight, a morally catastrophic mistake that his superiors, the heads of the agency, would immediately correct if they were simply made aware of it, Buxton wrote a formal, passionate letter. In 1966, he sent this detailed, meticulously argued letter directly to the directors of the Venereal Disease Division of the PHS in Atlanta, the very people in charge of the study, outlining his profound ethical, moral, and, critically, scientific objection. Buxton's argument was twofold. First, and most obviously, He argued that the study was a moral abomination, a racist, unethical experiment that violated every conceivable principle of medical ethics and human decency. He argued that it was, in effect, no different from the horrific medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors in concentration camps, for which the United States had, just 2 decades earlier, prosecuted those same doctors at Nuremberg. But Buxton, as a scientist himself, also made a second, cleverer argument. He argued that the study was, on its own terms, bad science. He pointed out that the PSS's claim of observing a pure, untreated population was a fantasy. He argued correctly that over the decades, some of the men in the study, in their pain and desperation, had inevitably sought outside treatment from local doctors or clinics, and had by chance received shots of penicillin for other ailments, thus contaminating the PSS's precious, pure data. Therefore, he argued, the study was not only immoral, it was scientifically worthless, and continuing it served no purpose other than cruelty. What was the PS's response to this clear, logical, and morally urgent internal whistleblower? Did they thank him for his moral clarity? Did they immediately convene an emergency ethics panel to halt the study and treat the men? No, Tao. They shut him down. High-level PHS officials, including the director of the Venereal Disease Division, Dr. William Brown, and Dr. John Heller himself, convened a meeting, not to discuss ending the study, as Buxton had demanded, but to discuss Peter Buxton's letter. They meticulously, bureaucratically, and with chilling, condescending detachment went through his arguments, one by one, and refuted them to their own satisfaction. They reaffirmed their collective institutional belief that the study was still scientifically valuable. They dismissed his moral concerns as naive and uninformed. They argued that the men were now too old and too far gone for penicillin to be of any real benefit, and that treating them now might even be dangerous, a cruel, paternalistic, and medically false justification. They effectively told Buxton that he, a low-level employee, was wrong, that he didn't understand the big picture, the scientific importance, and that he should drop the matter immediately if he valued his career in public health. The system, faced with a direct internal moral challenge, did not break. It simply, smoothly, and terrifyingly protected itself. The 40-year lie continued uninterrupted. Peter Buxton was stunned, disillusioned, and horrified. He realized the system was not just negligent. It was actively, consciously corrupt. He resigned from the Public Health Service shortly thereafter, in 1968, in large part over this very issue, his conscience unable to coexist with the agency's actions. But he never, ever forgot. The knowledge of what was happening in Macon County, Alabama, the fact that this state-sponsored racist atrocity was continuing, day after day, haunted him. He went to law school, trying to build a new life, but the unresolved file on Tuskegee remained open in his mind. He knew, from his own bitter experience, that the official channels had failed. He knew the system was a closed loop, morally bankrupt and incapable of policing itself. He realized that the only force on earth capable of stopping this study was not inside the government. It was outside it. The only power that could override the entrenched, self-protecting bureaucracy of the PHS was the power of raw, overwhelming public outrage. And the only way to generate that was to expose the secret to the world. He waited. He gathered his thoughts, his evidence. And then, nearly 6 years after his internal protest was arrogantly dismissed, he made a fateful decision. He decided to leak the entire story to the press. Wrong. In 1972, Peter Buxton, now a lawyer and understanding the legal jeopardy of leaking classified government information, carefully contacted a friend, Edith Lederer, a reporter for the Associated Press, UPRG. He told her the basic, horrifying facts. Lederer, recognizing the potential magnitude of the story, put Buxton in touch with a veteran AP investigative journalist named John Heller. Buxton meticulously laid out the entire story for Heller. He didn't just provide a wild allegation, he provided the proof. He gave her the names of the PHS doctors in charge, like Dr. John Heller. He gave her the history of the study, its 1932 origin. He gave her the references to the 15 obscure but publicly available medical papers the PHS had published, the papers that openly admitted the men were untreated. And he gave her the single most horrifying explosive fact: the study was still ongoing in 1972, 25 years after the discovery of penicillin, and the men were still being actively, deliberately denied the cure. John Heller, a seasoned, skeptical investigative reporter, was, like Buxton before her, initially incredulous. The story seemed too monstrous, too evil, to possibly be true. It sounded like a grotesque conspiracy theory, not a documented 40-year policy of the United States government's public health service. But she was a professional. She did her job. She went to the medical libraries and pulled the 15 obscure articles Buxton had cited. And there, in the dry, clinical, dispassionate language of scientists, she found the truth, hidden in plain sight for all the medical world to see. The papers openly discussed the untreated subjects, the control group, the progression of the disease, the autopsy findings. The horror was real. It was all true. Armed with this documentation, Heller then began making calls. She called the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, which now had oversight of the study. She got through to the very PX officials in charge of the venereal disease branch. And in a chilling testament to just how normalized, how bureaucratic, how completely immoral the study had become to those inside the system, the officials confirmed it. They didn't deny it. They didn't try to hide it, at least not initially, from a reporter they likely assumed was working on a routine, historical piece. They defended it. They confirmed to Heller that yes, the study was ongoing. Yes, the men had not been given penicillin. They tried to justify it, just as they had to Buxton, explaining its unique scientific value, the importance of the longitudinal data, how this was a one-of-a-kind opportunity. They had become so insulated, so morally adrift in their own bureaucratic echo chamber, that they no longer even recognized the profound, explosive monstrosity of what they were calmly admitting to a journalist from the Associated Press. On the morning of July 25, 1972, the story broke. John Heller's article, meticulously sourced and fact-checked, was distributed by the AP wire service. It landed like a bomb on the front pages of newspapers across the country, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. The headline was stark, simple, and devastating. Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. The 40-year lie was over. The secret, kept in plain sight of the entire medical establishment for 4 decades, was finally, irrevocably, exposed to the full, horrifying glare of public light. The reaction was not academic. It was not bureaucratic. It was a universal, instantaneous, bipartisan explosion of profound shock, visceral disgust, and deep, furious moral outrage. The American public, already deeply cynical about its government in the midst of the escalating Watergate scandal and the bitter divisions of the Vietnam War, was nonetheless unprepared for this. This was different. This wasn't a political dirty trick or a failed military policy. This was, as Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts would later call it on the Senate floor, a medical holocaust, a nightmarish example of moral bankruptcy. Editorials across the nation, from the most liberal to the most conservative, erupted in unified condemnation. How could this happen? How could American doctors, in the name of science, replicate the very atrocities the world had condemned the Nazis for at the Nuremberg trials? The U.S. government, which had served as a prosecutor of Nazi doctors for their horrific experiments on human beings, was now revealed to have been conducting its own 40-year, non-therapeutic, deadly experiment on its own citizens. The hypocrisy was staggering, the moral stench overwhelming. None? The federal government, caught completely, humiliatingly flat-footed by the AP story, scrambled to react. The PHS and CDC, the very agencies whose officials had been calmly defending the study to Jean Heller just days earlier, were now in a state of full-blown, desperate panic. Their immediate reaction was not one of immediate contrition, but of frantic damage control. They tried to spin the story, to minimize the damage, to obscure the facts. They falsely claimed, in initial press releases, that at the beginning, way back in 1932, the men had been treated with the standard, toxic treatments of the day, deliberately omitting the fact that the study's entire premise was to not treat them, and that those early treatments were haphazard, partial, and quickly abandoned. They tried to argue, as they had internally for years, that the men were too old or too far gone in the disease's progression for penicillin to be of any real benefit anyway, a claim that was medically false, as penicillin could have stopped the disease's progression at any stage, cured the latent infections, prevented further cardiovascular or neurological damage, and most critically, prevented the men from transmitting the disease to their wives and partners, and congenitally to their children. But the public and political firestorm was far too intense for these weak, self-serving justifications. Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, a powerful figure in the Senate and the chairman of the Health Subcommittee, immediately convened emergency congressional hearings. The nation watched, horrified, as PHS and CDC officials, including Dr. John Heller, the former director of the PHS who had overseen the study for years, were dragged before the television cameras. They were forced under oath to answer for their actions. These men, who had operated in the comfortable, insulated darkness of bureaucratic authority for decades, now had to defend the indefensible under the hot, bright, unforgiving lights of public scrutiny. They stammered. They obfuscated. They hid behind scientific jargon, the value of the data, and the different ethical standards of the 1930s. But the simple, human, horrifying truth was undeniable. Under this immense, unbearable pressure from the public, the press, and a furious Congress, the government finally did what it should have, and could have, done 25 years earlier. In November 1972, just 4 months after Jean Heller's article broke the story, the Assistant Secretary for Health and Scientific Affairs, Dr. Merlin Duval, formally, and almost quietly, terminated the Tuskegee study. The 40-year experiment was over. For the surviving men in the study, this was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of profound, terrifying confusion. For 40 years, they had been told by the government doctors and the trusted Nurse Rivers that they had bad blood and were receiving special free treatment from Washington. Now, suddenly, vans of new, different government doctors, along with lawyers and reporters, descended on Macon County, seeking them out in their rural homes. These men, now elderly, frail, and suffering from the ravages of a 40-year illness, were finally, bluntly, told the truth. They were told they did not have bad blood. They had syphilis, a bad sexually transmitted disease. They were told the tonics, the vitamins, and the aspirin they had received for 40 years were worthless placebos. They were told that the special free treatments, the painful, agonizing spinal taps they had endured, were just tests to see how the disease had rotted their spines. And they were told, most horrifyingly, incomprehensibly of all, that a simple, cheap cure, penicillin, had existed for decades, and had been deliberately, systematically withheld from them by the very people they trusted most. Now, William Wadurzi. Estimated time, 1:35–1:40. Narrator. The psychological impact of this revelation on the survivors is almost impossible to comprehend. The men had trusted Nurse Rivers as a friend, a confidante, almost a family member. They had trusted the doctors from the prestigious Tuskegee Institute. They had trusted the government men from Washington, who in their poverty they saw as powerful, benevolent figures. They had believed, for 40 years, that they were being cared for by their country. To learn in their old age that they had in fact been observed like lab rats in a cage, that their suffering, their blindness, their paralysis, and the deaths of their friends and brothers in the study had been nothing more than data for a scientific paper. It was a betrayal so deep, so complete, so fundamentally evil. Their trust in medicine, in government, in authority, in any institution, was irrevocably, permanently destroyed. The immediate, tangible consequences of the study's 40-year run were devastating, a grim, final tally of human suffering directly attributable to the PHS's actions. By the time the study was terminated in 1972, only 74 of the original 399 syphilitic men were still alive. At least 28 of the men, and by some later, more realistic estimates, more than 100, had died directly from advanced tertiary syphilis. The heart disease, the brain damage, the burst aneurysms. The rest had died of other complications, their lives almost certainly shortened and racked with pain by the untreated chronic infection. But the collateral damage, the ripple effect of the betrayal, spread far beyond just the 399 men. In a cruel generational second wave of the tragedy, it was found that at least 40 of their wives had, over the decades, become infected with syphilis from their husbands, who had no idea they were infectious. And, in the most heartbreaking consequence of all, at least 19 of their children had been born with congenital syphilis, an agonizing, deforming, and often fatal condition passed from mother to child at birth, a condition that was 100% preventable with a simple shot of penicillin. The PHS's study was not just a passive act of observation. It was an active vector of disease, a public health menace responsible for creating new innocent generations of victims. In the immediate wake of the public exposure, the legal and ethical fallout began to rain down. In 1973, the ENEACP, on behalf of the study's elderly, frail survivors and the grieving families of the deceased, filed a $1.8 billion class action lawsuit against the U.S. Public Health Service, the CDC, the state of Alabama, and the Tuskegee Institute. The lead attorney on the case was Fred Gray, a prominent, courageous, and highly skilled black civil rights lawyer from Alabama who had famously and fearlessly represented both Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the Montgomery bus boycott. This lawsuit was not about obscure scientific minutiae. It was about fundamental human rights. It argued that the United States government had, through deceit, manipulation, and profound racial discrimination, violated the men's most basic 14th Amendment constitutional rights to life, liberty, and due process. The heart disease, the brain damage, the burst aneurysms. The rest had died of other complications, their lives almost certainly shortened and racked with pain by the untreated chronic infection. But the collateral damage, the ripple effect of the betrayal, spread far beyond just the 399 men. In a cruel generational second wave of the tragedy, it was found that at least 40 of their wives had, over the decades, become infected with syphilis from their husbands, who had no idea they were infectious. And, in the most heartbreaking consequence of all, at least 19 of their children had been born with congenital syphilis, an agonizing, deforming, and often fatal condition passed from mother to child at birth, a condition that was 100% preventable with a simple shot of penicillin. The PHS's study was not just a passive act of observation. It was an active vector of disease, a public health menace responsible for creating new innocent generations of victims. In the immediate wake of the public exposure, the legal and ethical fallout began to rain down. In 1973, the ENEACP, on behalf of the study's elderly, frail survivors and the grieving families of the deceased, filed a $1.8 billion class action lawsuit against the U.S. Public Health Service, the CDC, the state of Alabama, and the Tuskegee Institute. The lead attorney on the case was Fred Gray, a prominent, courageous, and highly skilled black civil rights lawyer from Alabama who had famously and fearlessly represented both Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the Montgomery bus boycott. This lawsuit was not about obscure scientific minutiae. It was about fundamental human rights. It argued that the United States government had, through deceit, manipulation, and profound racial discrimination, violated the men's most basic 14th Amendment constitutional rights to life, liberty, and due process. The state of Michigan, in late September 2015, had drawn its battle lines. It was engaged in a full-scale public relations war, not against the lead poisoning itself, but against the whistleblowers who had dared to expose it. They had publicly, arrogantly, and falsely branded Dr. Mark Edwards as a rogue scientist and Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha as an irresponsible pediatrician who was splicing and dicing data to create needless panic. The state's official, unified message, from Governor Rick Snyder's office down through the MDQ and the Department of Health and Human Services, DHS, was clear, consistent, and completely false. The water is safe. The tests are fine. The kids are fine. Edwards and Hanna-Attisha are wrong. Their data is flawed. Their motives suspect. This was the apex of the betrayal, a moment of institutional gaslighting on a citywide scale. The very agencies, legally and morally, tasked with protecting public health were actively, publicly attacking the doctors and scientists who were presenting verifiable, statistically sound proof of a massive public health disaster. But this fortress of lies, so brazenly constructed in public, was simultaneously and rapidly collapsing from within. The state government, it turned out, was not a monolith. While the MDQ was actively manipulating data, and the governor's office was aggressively attacking the whistleblowers, other experts inside the state's own bureaucracy were looking at the exact same data as Dr. Mona and coming to the exact same horrifying and career-threatening conclusion. Just days after Dr. Mona's explosive press conference, while she was enduring the worst of the public and private attacks, state epidemiologists at the DHHS, the state's own health department, were ordered by their superiors, likely in a panic, to reanalyze their own internal blood lead level data. This was the very data the governor's spokesman and other officials had used, just days before, to publicly refute Dr. Mona's findings, claiming their numbers showed no spike. When these state scientists, these non-political experts, ran the numbers correctly, without the political spin, without the flawed methodologies, they found Dr. Mona was right. Their own internal analysis, buried in state spreadsheets, confirmed a statistically significant, undeniable, and alarming spike in childhood blood lead levels in Flint, and that this spike correlated perfectly, geographically and temporally, with the switch to the Flint River. This finding, this internal, irrefutable confirmation that the state was actively poisoning its children and that Dr. Mona's research was 100% correct, was not immediately released to the public. It was communicated up the chain of command. It landed, in the form of a terrifying internal report, on the desk of Governor Snyder's Chief of Staff, Dennis Muchmore, on September 28, 2015. This was the moment the governor's highest-ranking aides knew, internally, and without a shadow of a doubt, that their entire public narrative was a complete fabrication, a lie. And what did they do? Did they immediately hold a press conference, apologize to Dr. Mona, and switch the water? No, but they buried the report. For crucial days, the governor's office, now inactive, knowing possession of their own data confirming the poisoning, continued to publicly attack Dr. Mona and Dr. Edwards, allowing the poisoning of Flint's children to continue for even longer. The betrayal had now reached the highest, most powerful levels of state government. It was no longer a matter of negligence or incompetence. It had transitioned into an active, knowing, and malicious cover-up in plain sight. But lies in the digital age, especially lies this big, are harder to contain. The local press, which had been understandably skeptical of the residents' complaints for over a year, was now armed with two credible independent scientific studies, one on the water chemistry from a MacArthur genius, the other on the human biological impact from a local respected pediatrician. The narrative was shifting. Journalists, particularly Kurt Guyette, an investigative reporter working with the ACLU of Michigan, had been relentlessly filing Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests, digging into the MDQ's internal emails, creating a paper trail of the cover-up. The state's wall of denial was crumbling. On September 25, 2015, the day after Dr. Mona's press conference, another bombshell dropped, exposing a parallel, an equally horrifying story of state failure. A coalition of local pastors, Flint residents, and activists, represented by the ACLU, announced their intent to file a federal lawsuit against the city and state, not just for lead, but for the illegally high levels of TFMMs, the carcinogenic byproducts of the massive chlorine dumping. The city, it turned out, had been in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act for TFMS for almost a year and had failed to properly notify the public. Residents were being poisoned not just by a neurotoxin, but by known carcinogens, and the state had knowingly let it happen. The pressure was becoming unbearable. The final, fatal blow to the state's narrative came from within its own ranks, but not from the health department. It came from Governor Snyder's own, hand-picked task force, the Flint Water Advisory Task Force, which he had created months earlier, largely as a public relations move to review Flint's finances and future. But they weren't just looking at spreadsheets. They were scientists and policy experts. They had seen the independent science from Edwards. They had seen the blood data from Hannah Atisha. They had seen the internal, suppressed DHHS report. And on October 8, 2015, they told the governor the undeniable truth in a preliminary briefing. The data from the whistleblowers was correct. The MDQ's data was wrong. The state's position was indefensible. The crisis was real, it was man-made, and his administration was unequivocally responsible for it. Trapped, with his own internal health department data confirming the poisoning, his own task force confirming the disaster, and the national media now descending on Flint in force, Governor Rick Snyder had nowhere left to hide. The cover-up had completely failed. That very same day, October 8, 2015, in a stunning, humiliating, and long overdue reversal, Governor Snyder held a press conference. He did not, notably, apologize, but he announced that the state would spend $6 million to switch the city of Flint back to the Detroit water system, DDUSD, as soon as possible. He also, finally, publicly admitted that the MDQ's interpretation of the federal lead and copper rule had been wrong, and that corrosion control should have been implemented from the very beginning. It was a staggering admission of failure. It was the truth, finally, surfacing. It was a victory, hard-won, for the residents. For Leanne Walters, for Melissa Mays, for Pastor Overton, for Mark Edwards, for Mona Hannah Atisha. After 18 months of drinking, bathing in, and fighting over poisoned water, after 18 months of being lied to, dismissed, patronized, and attacked by their own government, the state had finally officially capitulated. The truth, exposed by a handful of courageous whistleblowers and the relentless activism of citizen scientists, had won. On October 16, 2015, the valves were turned, and clean, safe, treated Lake Huron water once again began to flow into the tortured pipes of Flint. The entire city cheered. There was a sense of profound relief. But this was not the end of the story. It was, in many ways, just the end of the beginning. The state and the nation were about to learn a terrible, irreversible lesson in basic chemistry. The wolf, the corrosive, untreated river water, had been loose in the house for 18 long months, and it had done permanent, catastrophic damage. Simply switching the water back didn't fix the pipes. The protective scale, the plaque that the properly treated Detroit water had slowly and carefully built up on the inside of the pipes over 50 years, was gone. The 18 months of acidic, chloride-laden river water had chemically stripped it away, like using drain cleaner on your arteries. The lead service lines, the lead solder in the plumbing, the brass fixtures, they were now exposed, scarred, raw, and more vulnerable to leaching than ever before. Even the new, clean, properly treated Detroit water, now flowing back into this damaged, destabilized system, was still picking up dangerous levels of lead. The poisoning, although slowed, was not over. The city's entire water infrastructure, its network of thousands of lead service lines, was a contaminated, ruined, ticking time bomb. The damage was done. The switchback was not a cure. It was just stopping the initial assault. The wound was still festering. And the lead wasn't even the only monster the river had unleashed. As the political and scientific investigations intensified in the wake of the switchback, a third, and in some ways even more deadly, secret began to surface. A secret that state officials had allegedly hidden even more aggressively, more consciously, than the lead. While Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha was analyzing blood lead levels, epidemiologists at the Genesee County Health Department, the local health officials were noticing another terrifying, parallel spike. A spike in a rare, severe, and often fatal illness, Legionnaire's disease. Legionnaire's is a severe, atypical form of pneumonia caused by the Legionella bacteria. This bacteria is common in freshwater, but it thrives and multiplies in warm, stagnant, human-made water systems, particularly those with low chlorine levels and high iron content. It is not spread by drinking the water, but by inhaling the bacteria in fine, aerosolized mist, typically from showers, humidifiers, hot tubs, or large-scale air conditioning units. The county health department, tracking hospital admissions, saw the numbers. In a typical year, Genesee County might see a handful of Legionnaire's cases, perhaps 6 to 13, scattered over the months. But in the summer of 2014, just after the switch to the Flint River, they saw a massive, undeniable outbreak. 47 cases. Another, smaller outbreak followed in the summer of 2015. In total, during the 18-month period that Flint was on river water, at least 91 people in the county were infected with Legionnaire's disease, and at least 12 people died. Later investigations, including a PBS Frontline report, would suggest this number was a significant undercount, and the true death toll was likely much higher, possibly over 70. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a direct, foreseeable consequence of the switch. The scientific link was horrifyingly clear. First, the corrosive Flint River water, with its high chloride content, was known to neutralize chlorine, the very disinfectant needed to kill bacteria like Legionella. The city's water plant was failing to maintain an adequate chlorine residual throughout the sprawling pipe system. Second, the same corrosive water was leaching massive amounts of iron from the city's old cast iron water mains. This iron, which was turning the water brown, was acting as a food source, a nutrient for the Legionella bacteria, allowing it to multiply exponentially within the pipe system. The state's decision to switch to the river, and its failure to add corrosion control, had created the perfect biological breeding ground for a deadly waterborne pathogen. The county health department knew they had an outbreak as early as October 2014. They sounded the alarm. They tried to warn the MDQ and the State Department of Health and Human Services, DHS, pointing to the water switch as the obvious likely cause and urging a public warning. And what was the state's response? The exact same playbook they used against the lead whistleblowers: denial, suppression, cover-up. Internal emails, later exposed by journalists and criminal investigators, show that high-level officials at the state DHHS and within Governor Snyder's own office were aware of this deadly Legionnaire's outbreak and its probable link to the water switch for nearly a full year before they said anything about it publicly. They knew people were getting sick, and they knew people were dying from a waterborne disease linked to the switch, even as they were simultaneously, publicly reassuring citizens that the water was safe and attacking Dr. Mona for her hysterical lead report. This was, perhaps, the most heinous betrayal of all. The lead poisoning would damage children's futures. The Legionnaires' outbreak was actively killing people. The state, obsessed with managing the public narrative of the emergency manager's success, and terrified of the political and financial fallout, chose to hide the body count. They chose to let people die rather than admit their catastrophic mistake. The truth of the Legionnaires' outbreak and the state's criminal suppression of it wouldn't become public knowledge until January 2016, long after the water had been switched back, when Governor Snyder, facing leaks and an impending journalistic expose, was finally forced to admit it in a press conference. The abuse of power was complete. They hadn't just poisoned with lead, they had exposed their citizens to a fatal bacterial plague and deliberately, consciously, covered it up. By January 2016, the entire rotten house of cards had completely collapsed. The truth, carried by the tireless, heroic work of Leanne Walters, Mark Edwards, Mona Hanna Atisha, the local activists of Flint, and the investigative reporters who had finally listened to them, had definitively, overwhelmingly, The story was no longer a local dispute in a poor Michigan city. It was the biggest, most shocking public health and environmental justice scandal in the world. On January 5, 2016, Governor Rick Snyder, the tough nerd CEO governor who had presided over this entire man-made catastrophe, finally, reluctantly, declared a state of emergency for Genesee County, officially acknowledging the disaster his own administration had created, denied, and covered up for more than a year and a half. Days later, he formally activated the Michigan National Guard, a move that produced the surreal, shocking, wartime images of American soldiers in fatigues on American streets, handing out bottles of water to American citizens in a Midwestern city, as if it were a hurricane zone or a failed state. Finally, on January 16th, President Barack Obama declared a federal state of emergency in Flint, unlocking federal resources from FEMA to provide water, filters, and other critical aid. The wolves, the emergency managers, the MDQ officials, the DHHS leaders, and the governor's inner circle were now fully exposed, their denials and attacks rendered absurd in the face of the horrifying, undeniable truth. The MDQ, the agency at the center of the scientific fraud, saw its leadership collapse. Its director, Dan Wyant, resigned in disgrace. The spokesman, Brad Werfel, the man who had infamously told residents to relax, was fired. The EPA's Region 5 administrator, Susan Hedman, was also forced to resign, criticized for her agency's failure to act more decisively, a failure caused in part by the MDQ's lies. Governor Snyder, once a rising star in the Republican Party, a potential presidential candidate, became a national pariah, synonymous with incompetence and callous indifference. He was forced to testify before the United States Congress in harrowing, televised hearings. He was forced to sit stony-faced and listen as Dr. Mark Edwards and Leanne Walters laid out the entire damning, documented timeline of his administration's negligence, arrogance, and deceit. In one of the most fiery exchanges, he was told by a congressman that he should resign, that his administration's actions were either deliberate or you're all grossly incompetent. The political and legal fallout was just beginning. Michigan's Attorney General, Bill Chouette, seeing the political winds shift, launched a full-scale investigation. He appointed an independent counsel, Todd Flood, who, over the next several years, would bring a raft of criminal charges, including involuntary manslaughter for the Legionnaires' deaths, misconduct in office, and conspiracy against more than a dozen state and city officials. Those charged included Darnell Early, the emergency manager, Stephen Bush, and Michael Presby, the MDQ engineers who allegedly manipulated the law and the tests, and even Nick Leon, the director of the state's Health and Human Services Department, for his alleged role in hiding the deadly Legionnaires out. It seemed, for a moment, that accountability was possible. The cover-up had led directly to criminal indictments. The city of Flint, now the center of global attention, was a humanitarian crisis zone. The water was still not safe. The pipes were ruined. Residents, their trust in government completely, perhaps permanently, shattered, were forced to live off bottled water for everything: drinking, cooking, bathing, brushing their teeth. This went on not for days or weeks, but for years. It became a way of life, a daily, exhausting reminder of their betrayal. The immediate crisis of the switch was over, but the long, painful, and still unfinished work of recovery had only just begun. The final chapter of the Flint water crisis is one that is still being written in courtrooms, in medical clinics, in community centers, and in the daily lives of its residents. The story did not end when the cameras left, or when the water was switched back to the Detroit system. The betrayal inflicted by the state government, a government that prioritized austerity over humanity and operated in plain sight, left deep, permanent scars on the city that cannot be so easily healed. The most immediate physical scar was the infrastructure. The 18 months of highly corrosive river water had, as Mark Edwards had proven, irrecoverably damaged Flint's water system dechined. The protective lining of the pipes was gone. The only real, long-term solution was to physically replace the city's thousands of lead and galvanized steel service lines, a monumental and colossally expensive task, block by block, house by house. After years of protracted bitter lawsuits, a massive $97 million court settlement was reached, finally funding this replacement. It has taken years, with excavation crews digging up lawns and sidewalks across the city, a visual reminder of the poison that once flowed beneath. While this process, driven by resident activism and court orders, is nearly complete, the fear remains. Many residents, even with new pipes, will not trust the tap. They continue to live on bottled water, a daily physical manifestation of their broken trust. The second, and more profound, scar is the human one. The long-term health consequences for the 100,000 residents who were exposed are still being calculated and may not be fully known for decades. For the at least 12 people who died from the state-suppressed Legionnaire's disease outbreak, and likely many more, the consequence was absolute. For the thousands of children, like Gavin Walters, who were exposed to high levels of a potent, irreversible neurotoxin during their most critical developmental years, the damage is insidious and lifelong. Lead poisoning doesn't go away. The impact on their collective cognitive development, their educational prospects, their risk for behavioral problems, and their future health is a ticking time bomb, a generational theft that can never be fully repaid. The residents of Flint also suffer from a profound collective psychological trauma, a condition now known as Flint fatigue. They live with the chronic, grinding stress of knowing their government, their protectors, poisoned them, and then lied about it. They grapple with the anxiety of not knowing what that exposure will mean for their children's future. This trauma is a community-wide public health crisis in itself. And what about accountability? What happened to the wolves in suits who perpetuated this? This, perhaps, is the final, most bitter betrayal of the entire saga. After years of criminal investigations, after millions of dollars spent, after multiple changes in the Attorney General's office, the entire legal process, the quest for justice, collapsed into a black hole of legal technicality. In 2019, a new prosecution team, under a new Attorney General, Dana Nessel, dropped all pending charges against the officials involved, including those for involuntary manslaughter, citing a flawed investigation by the previous team. They opted to start over. Then, In 2021, a new set of indictments were brought, including misdemeanor charges against former Governor Rick Snyder himself. But in 2022, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that the one-man grand jury used to bring those indictments was an unconstitutional, invalid process. As a result of this ruling, all criminal charges against all officials involved in the Flint water crisis were dismissed. After all the lies, all the data manipulation, all the cover-ups, all the poison, all the children with lead in their blood, all the deaths from legionnaires, not a single person, not one official, has been held criminally accountable. The cover-up in the end was legally successful. A massive civil settlement of over $600 million was reached, with the majority of that money, fittingly, earmarked for the children of Flint. But no amount of money can restore a single lost IQ point or bring back a life lost to Legionnaire's disease. The story of Flint, Michigan, stands as a horrifying modern-day testament to the dangers of unelected, autocratic power, the failure of regulatory agencies, and the devastating human cost of prioritizing budget spreadsheets over human life. It is a story of systemic environmental racism, a crisis that, by all accounts, would never have been allowed to happen, or would have been fixed in a day in a wealthier, whiter community. It is the ultimate story of a government betraying its people in plain sight. Now here at Plain Sight Docs, we don't believe these stories are just history. They are warnings. The betrayal of Flint, the corruption of its officials, and the abuse of power that suspended democracy itself are not just a Michigan problem. They are an American warning. They are a file that must never be closed. The mainstream narrative moves on. The news cycle forgets. But we believe the only way to prevent future betrayals is to meticulously document the ones that have already occurred, to understand exactly how they happened in plain sight. Our goal is to build a community, an archive of these cases, and we cannot do that without you. If you believe this investigation was important, if you believe this story needed to be told in its full, uncomfortable detail, the most powerful way you can support this work is by liking this video. It tells the algorithm that this history matters, that these facts must surface. But more importantly, we need your voice. What part of this systemic failure do you find the most unforgivable? The decision to save money? The falsified tests? The attacks on the doctors? Or the final, staggering lack of criminal accountability? Let us know in the comments below. Your analysis, your insights, and your suggestions for other hidden stories are the lifeblood of this channel. What other betrayals, hidden in plain sight, must we investigate next? And finally, if you believe in this mission, if you want to be part of a community that refuses to let these stories be forgotten, then subscribe to Plain Sight Docs and, crucially, click the notification bell. You won't just be notified of a new video. You'll be the first to know when the next file has been opened. Thank you for watching. Stay vigilant and never stop questioning the official story.